Hey y'all, my name's Amanda and today I'm going to give you 5 tips that will help you straighten up the edges of your crochet projects so they come out looking more like this and less like this. So I know that uneven edges are an issue that a lot of people struggle with, especially when they're new to crochet, and I'll show you what I'm talking about by uneven edges. So on this square and this square, I did the same number of stitches and the same number of rows. These are just double crochet, but they look totally different along all of the edges of the square. And the reason for that is I used different techniques for the beginning chain, working into the beginning chain, and I used different techniques on the beginning and ending stitches of each row and on the chaining and the turning at the end of each row. So I'm going to give you 5 tips that will help your square look more like this one with even edges all the way around and less like this one with kind of some rough edges. And the other thing you'll notice on this square, the bottom, which is this is where I worked into the foundation chain, the starting chain, and the top look the same. So these kind of look the same on both ends. This one, you can see where I worked the last row, looks similar to both sides of this one, but this bottom edge where I worked into the foundation chain looks a little different. So this one isn't as uniform, and I'm going to show you how I did that. Here's another example. Same methodology, using the same tips for a different yarn. And I will try to post anytime I have a yarn or a hook or any sort of tool that I use in a video, I'll try to post in the link down below what it is that those yarns are and what the tools are that I'm using. So on this one, again, same tips, the 5 tips I'm going to show you. This one I worked the same number of double crochet, same number of rows, and they turned out differently. The top and the bottom of this one look pretty uniform. The top and the bottom of this one look rather different, and this bottom edge is not as nice and neat and pretty as the top edge here and the 2 edges here. This is the yarn I'm going to use to demonstrate these 5 techniques for you. This is a square that I did without using any of the techniques, so this is akin to the ones that were on the right in the other 2 comparisons that have more of the rough edges. And this is again just several rows of double crochet. It looks like 6 rows of double crochet, and it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 stitches. So I'm going to work 6 rows of double crochet with 11 stitches in this same yarn and show you how it turns out differently. I'm using an eye hook. If anyone's curious, this is an eye hook, which is also known as a size 9 hook, and 5.5 millimeter. This is a boy with a boy brand. It has a tapered tip. I much prefer this type of crochet hook. They have the ones that are kind of flatter on the end, and I find that the way that I crochet those tend to get caught on the yarn. But I will post information about this hook in the description box as well. So I want to end up with 11 stitches, and to do that I'm actually going to chain 12 stitches, 12 chains, and I'll show you why I'm doing that number here in a minute. But I'm just going to start with a slip stitch just like you always do on my crochet hook, and I'm going to chain 12. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And so this is tip number 1. Normally, most people when they crochet or when they're learning to crochet, you can see the V shapes that are each of the chain stitches. Most of the time people work into sort of this top loop of the V. So they go in this way when they do their stitches in the chain. Go in here. And what I do instead that gives that even looking edge on the bottom of the project is I turn this just a little bit. I don't know if you can see. Take the hook out so I can show you. So this is the front side where you can see the V shapes of the stitches. And then if you turn it over, if you see these little bumps, so these little bumps kind of like a spine going back along the back side of the chain of stitches. That is what I'm going to work into. So I'll show you how I do that. I've chained 12. I want to end up with 11 stitches, so I've chained 12. And I'm going to turn my work so that those little bumps on the back are visible. These little bumps here. I'm going to skip the first one, skip this first chain, and work into this bump here. And I'm doing double crochet. So I'm going to yarn over, go into this bump instead of going into the chain stitch, work my double crochet. Same thing again, I'm going to work into this bump that runs along the back of these stitches. I'm just going to do that all the way across. I'm not working into this side, I'm working into these bumps that sort of stick up on the back of that chain row. I'm just going to do that all the way across. Working in the bumps all the way across the back. So this is the first tip that I have that will even up your edges, is working into these back bumps as opposed to working into the top loop of the foundation chain. All right, so you can see on the bottom side of my work how it is a much more even edge on the bottom side. It looks more like a row of actual just crochet stitches on the bottom instead of the rougher edge that you normally have with the normal method of working into the loop on top of the chain. So now that I've worked the first row of double crochet and I have a nice even edge on the bottom, I'm going to give you tip number 2, which has to do with how you turn your work to go back along the top of this row to do your second row of stitches. To do that, it's a kind of a 2-part tip. One, I recommend that you chain before you turn. So if your pattern for what you're working on says to chain 2 and then turn your work, you definitely want to chain before you do the turn, as opposed to turning your work and then doing the chain. It doesn't sound like it would make a difference, but it really does as far as how evenly your edges end up being. So chain 2, turn your work, and the second part of the tip is to turn your work this way, like across the front of the piece, instead of turning it this way across the back. So you want to take the piece that you worked on and turn it across the front instead of across the back. And if you do that, it will help the edges lie flatter and more evenly, look straighter. All right, now for tip number 3. When you're reading a pattern, most of the time, if you're just doing rows back and forth of single crochet, double crochet, whatever it might be, it's going to tell you to skip this first stitch, skip the first stitch in the row, and go into the second stitch. Tip number 3 to keep your edges looking straighter is to not skip this first stitch and instead double crochet into this stitch. So that's what I'm going to do. I did my chain 2 in my turn, so I'm going to double crochet directly into that first stitch of the row instead of skipping. And then I'm just going to double crochet across the whole row. I'm going to double crochet across the whole row until I get to the end of the row, and then I'll show you tip number 4, which is what I recommend that you do at the end of your row of stitches. So I actually have 2 stitches left to work into. This double crochet that stands alone, so I can mark here, and then this double crochet that's very much kind of tied into and mixed in with this beginning chain that I did at the beginning of the first row. So this crochet, double crochet, I'm just going to double crochet into like normal. Now all that I have left is this stitch here with the 2 chains here. If you were following just normal rules for double crocheting at the end of a row, you would work into this here. You would work into the actual stitch. What I'm going to do instead, this is tip number 4, is work into the space between the double crochet and the beginning chains of the row, the prior row. So I'm going to work my double crochet not into the double crochet, but into this gap here. So that's going to be tip number 4 for straightening your edges. So work that double crochet. All right. So you can see already these edges are looking pretty good and pretty even. And the last tip I'm going to give you, and these tips will carry you all the way through the work, but the 5th tip is to count your stitches after your second row. Now if you're working on a project that has a whole lot of stitches on it, you might think it's kind of a pain to do that, but it's going to save yourself a lot of grief in the future. And once you know that this second row of stitches is correct, then you can just make sure you don't skip any when you go back and forth, and you'll have the right number. So I said I wanted to end up with 11 stitches, and let me show you how to count these with the different way to begin your row with those chains and working into the first stitch. So obviously this is 1 stitch here, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and you are not going to count this chain 2 that you did at the beginning of the row. You are not going to count that as a stitch, because essentially when you crochet the way they sort of traditionally recommend that you do that, your chain 2 counts as your first double crochet of the row, or they will tell you that it doesn't count. But in this case, you do not want to count it as a double crochet. So again, I wanted 11 stitches. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and I don't count the chain as one of the crochet, the double crochets. All right. So let's go back the other way using those tips that I recommended. So now we're getting ready to chain and turn again. So remember to chain 2. If it's single crochet, it would be chain 1, but if you're doing double or half double, you're going to chain 2 before you turn your work. Do the chains before you turn your work. Turn your work toward the front of you, of the piece, toward yourself, as opposed to turning it this way. Turn it toward the front. And then I'm not going to skip this first double crochet stitch and go into the second one. Instead, I'm going to do my first double crochet directly into the double crochet at the beginning of the row, and then just work double crochet all the way across the row. A little tip I'll give you that's not really related specifically to crochet, but it's helpful if you're watching these types of tutorials on YouTube. You can actually click the little gear icon and slow down the playback of the video. If you feel like it's going a little too fast for you, you can have it play at like half speed, or you can also speed them up, but if you need it to slow down, you can play the video more slowly with the settings in the YouTube player. So I've gotten to the end of the row with just my 1 double crochet, and the chains that I did at the beginning of the previous row, I'm going to work, like I said before, into the space. I'm not going to work into this actual double crochet. I'm going to work into the space. And do my last double crochet. So we're going to do 6 rows of double crochet. So I'm going to finish this piece, and then I will cut the yarn and show you what it looks like compared to this one that I did in the same stitch pattern. All right, I'm reaching the end of the 6th row of double crochet. I am going to work in the space between the last 2 stitches, the last stitch and the chain 2 of the previous row. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 rows. I'm going to pull through, so this is just the same way you would end any crochet project like this. You're gonna pull through a stitch and then snip it, leaving it long enough to weave in. I'm not gonna weave in these ends just to show you this, but so this is 6 rows, 11 stitches of double crochet using those methods that I recommended. Those 5 tips. And then this is the same thing, 6 rows, double crochet, not following those 5 pieces of advice. So again, you can see that there are some differences here in the edges on the side. This looks nice on both ends. This one's upside down, but this one looks a little rough on the bottom, nice and clean on the top. So there you have it. Thanks for clicking play on this video. If you found it helpful, I'd love it if you could give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions or suggestions for other videos, you can leave a comment below. If you'd like to see more videos from me in the future, then you can click the red subscribe button and turn on notifications with a little bell icon so you get a message every time I post a new video. Thanks again for stopping by, guys. I really appreciate it. Bye.